Hey there, Twisters. Welcome back. It's been a while, right? Well, anyway, today we're going to talk about the most burning question for each NHL team heading into the 2023-24 season. We're about 7 weeks away as I make this video. I'm so fired up for this season to just start already. But anyway, let's look into each team and kind of talk about the X factor for each team's success, whether that's this season or in the near future, or perhaps some of the big concerns that I have for these teams going into the season. Of course, let me know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. What is your chief concern for your favorite team out there? Now, before I get started, two things here. First of all, I want to shout out my best friend Thomas. I was recently in California for a few days. I don't get out there very often, but he hooked me up with this fantastic jersey. Check this out. That's from the San Jose Fire Department. They actually have a hockey team there. They have these sick shoulder logos as well. So it was great catching up with him. This is a fantastic addition to my collection. So big shout out there. And also, I wanted to kind of spotlight one of you out there. And who better to kick this off than LA Basin Rails. So Rails, if you're watching, hold on just a second here. This is the kind of engagement that we want on this channel. Rails had commented on a previous video. This is a little bit off topic, but I had the best banana of my life this morning. I mean, that adds so much value to the Twisted Wrister hockey community. Now, guys, LA Basin Rails has his own channel where he's talking about trains, transit systems, especially in Southern California. So if that sort of thing interests you, train history, definitely check out his channel. I'll put a link down in the pinned comment down below. And Rails, just with how you've been able to hold me accountable for every goal treat that I need to give my dog Cortana, I would be most happy to give you a Twisted Wrister hockey t-shirt. So reach out to me. Let's reward you for your support of this channel. And of course, that would only naturally segue to this. We do have Twisted Wrister hockey merch available, guys. Just see the video description for a link to that. We're going to start with the Pacific Division. I've got this written out in kind of my own order here. We'll start with the Vegas Golden Knights. Of course, people will say, well, are they going to have a Stanley Cup hangover? Sure, that could certainly be a burning question going into this year. But let's see what Jack Eichel could do in an 82-game season. Could he have the best season of his career? Could he be above a point per game last season? Significantly above a point per game. So his best season came a few years ago when he had 82 points on a bad Sabres team. So I'm wondering, can he have a 95-plus point season? You especially look at how he performed in the playoffs. I know it's a different season for hockey, essentially. He had 6 goals and 20 assists. And if the Knights do kind of regress, you do have some aging defensemen on that team, as great as they performed in that run of theirs. But could Eichel be that guy who, game in, game out, is catalyzing their offense? Now for the Edmonton Oilers, whose net is it anyway? So we've seen Jack Campbell being brought in for free agency, but he had a bad season, an .888 save percentage, a 3.41 goals against average. Although he played in relief for Skinner in the playoffs, and he looked pretty good, he does have quite a good career going into his time in Edmonton. And then you also have, with the Oilers, you have Stuart Skinner. Now, Skinner was one of the finalists for the Calder Trophy. He had a really good run, and then he kind of folded in the playoffs. Now, I don't think it's all his fault, but he did look suspect on some of those goals that he let in. So for the Oilers, it didn't really make any big defensive changes. We will see some more Philip Broberg, and it's good to have Matthias Ekholm for a full season, but they will need one of those goaltenders to have ownership of the net going into the postseason, and hopefully from there, they can hold the net. Anyway, for the Seattle Kraken, now I'm not going to talk about goaltending for each team, even though that would be a chief concern for a lot of them, but for the Kraken, to me, it's goaltending depth. Yeah, they have Philip Grubauer, but he just doesn't look like the Philip Grubauer of old so far in Seattle in his 2 seasons there. An .895 save percentage, a 2.85 goals against average. And keep in mind, the Kraken allowed the second fewest shots in the NHL this past season. So Grubauer hasn't looked as good as advertised, to say the least. And when you look behind him, they have a Chris Driedger, who it's almost like his time in Florida never even happened. Unfortunately, he's been plagued by injuries. He didn't even play at all this past season. And you also have Joey Daccord, who is more of a third-string goaltender out there. So for the Kraken, will there be an opportunity to maybe make a move later on in the season? All right, Vancouver Canucks. This, of course, is kind of what you would ask from last year. Can they continue to play like they did last season with their interim head coach? So everything was just candy canes and rainbows with Bruce Boudreau. And then, of course, last year happened, right? So then Rick Tocchet comes in this past season, and they have a 20-12-4 record with him. That's pretty damn good, right? And in the Pacific, that could keep you in contention for a wild card spot, I would think. So in order for that to happen, you'll have to have Thatcher Demko playing kind of like he did when he came back from injury this past season. His last 16 games, I won't count his first start from injury. Usually goaltenders don't do too well. He had a .920 save, and he allowed 39 goals in those 16 games. Really, if he can stay the course, if Pettersson can continue to progress as well, this team could actually be a bit of a sleeper team to maybe make the playoffs. The Pacific is getting a little bit better too, and the Central's getting a bit weaker. All right, LA Kings. So I won't keep going down the goaltending track, although we could talk about Copley and Talbot for a team that could be a sexy pick to get to the Stanley Cup final this year. But now with Pierre-Luc Dubois a lot in their center depth, right? Is this a top 5 offense in the NHL? The Kings have turned into this offensive firepower very quickly. The likes of Kevin Fiala certainly do help with this team. They were 10th in goals for this past season. They were 4th on the power play. And you also have to, of course, consider somebody like Quentin Byfield, who I think is due for a breakout season. He could be, perhaps above the 45, maybe 50 point mark. You do have somebody like Arthur Kaliev further down the depth chart, or you could even bring in another weapon like Alex Turcotte. So there are plenty of weapons on this LA Kings team, and now that they're playing together for another year, is this where we see them take their offense to a new level? All right, Calgary Flames. This is definitely a team that could be boom or bust in a sense. They're not expected to be necessarily at the top of the division, but what if they get a bounce back season from a couple of players, especially Jonathan Huberdeau, just before he came over to Calgary? God, it seems like forever ago that he was having a Hart Trophy caliber season with the Panthers. You also had Andrew Mangiapane, whose goal production was cut in half this past season. Even some other players like Elias Lindholm, Mikhail Backlund, they did regress a bit this past season after a fantastic campaign 2 years ago. But if especially somebody like Huberdeau gets his mojo going, could this team find themselves back into at least playoff contention? And if that doesn't happen early, do we see that fire sale, of course, with the likes of Lindholm, Backlund, and also Noah Hannafin as well? These players have been essentially reported to not be interested in extending deals in Calgary. They're all UFAs after this next season. For the Anaheim Ducks, you could ask a ton of questions here, but will they finally climb out of the cellar in the Pacific Division this year? Out of the Cellar, good album by Rat. They have another year of Zegras and McTavish. I have said this before. I think McTavish is the next captain of this team, so it's his opportunity to take reins of this franchise. They do have some good veteran talent that they brought in the likes of, Mr. committing penalties and yelling in goalies' faces himself, Radko Gudas, in addition to Alex Killorn. I do like Killorn quite a bit, so they could flourish a little bit more offensively. Troy Terry, he needs to get back toward the 30-goal mark, especially having signed that big extension there. Also, Jamie Drysdale will be healthy this season. We do need to see a big step forward for him as a franchise cornerstone on defense, at least while we wait for a couple of their strong defensive prospects in their system. All right, my team, San Jose Sharks. Okay, will we finally see somebody from their development program make an impact on this team? The Sharks, I gotta say it, they've done a crappy job of developing their talent. Not that they've had the greatest scope of talent to begin with, but this year we look at two players in particular, William Eklund and Thomas Bordeleau. I have seen Bordeleau projected as now a bottom 6 center, whereas he had been initially projected as more of a second line center, so that does concern me a bit. Eklund, I like this guy's raw skill set. He'll be a lot of fun to watch this upcoming season. So those guys, I need to see one of them at least this year look like a full-time NHLer and ideally somebody in the top 6. Daniil Gushchin is another one as well. Henry Thrun on defense traded over from the Ducks in the offseason for a Sharks defense that should be horrible this upcoming season. And of course, will this team land the first overall pick? I don't think there's any excuse why they can't have the worst record in the Pacific Division. All right, now we go to the Metropolitan Division. So let's start here with the New Jersey Devils. Huge step forward this past season. So how much better can this team be with a full season from Luke Hughes, their defenseman, and Alexander Holtz? First of all, with Holtz, could he be essentially the Dawson Mercer from this last year? Mercer had 27 goals. He could be 35 plus this upcoming year. And as for Hughes, the team did have to lose a couple of their defensemen like Graves and Severson in the offseason, but Luke Hughes, he was already inserted into the lineup in the playoffs. Now for the Rangers, I've been saying this all offseason, I think. I look at those players on the kid line, right? Hedel, Kakko, and Lafreniere. Now with Peter Laviolette coming in as head coach, I'm curious to see how he manages his lines. but it looks inevitable that at least one of those players will have to play in the top 6 pretty much full time. They do have a couple of aging veterans on that side of things. They did lose Tarasenko and Kane, so can one of these guys, at least one of them, flourish in that sort of role? Now, they were all productive this past season. Hedl, 22 goals, 23 assists. Kakko, 18 goals, 22 assists. Lafreniere, 16 and 23. So if you give them an increased role, can they actually elevate their game to that next level? There is some optimism there. I'm just curious to see who it's going to be for them. All right, Columbus Blue Jackets. How will their new defensive upgrades perform? So I could have asked a variety of questions here. Of course, how good could they be with Laine potentially at center this upcoming season? What's Mike Babcock going to do? How is he going to have an impact on some of these young players? Really looking forward to a lot of their young forwards out there like Kirill Marchenko and Kent Johnson. But this is a team that struggles quite a bit when it comes to surrendering shots. They were the second worst in the NHL this past year, and their goaltending tandem is not exactly stellar with the likes of the young Daniil Tarasov. He could certainly take a step forward this year. And you also have Elvis Merzlikins, So I look at Ivan Provorov. He does have a good history of shot blocking. Damon Severson, he was part of a Devils defense that was really good in terms of keeping the puck out of the net, especially surrendering not that many opportunities. They were 5th best in the NHL in that standpoint. And you look at the underlying possession metrics, all that good stuff. Severson had himself a very good year. For the Pittsburgh Penguins, how will this team perform with a defensive core that now features not only Chris Letang, but also Erik Karlsson? It really wasn't that efficient of a deployment for the Sharks a few years ago. Totally different team right now in Pittsburgh, but even so, I'm curious to see kind of how their opportunities are managed by their coaching in terms of who's deployed offensively, who gets power play 1 versus power play 2, that sort of thing. It's going to be really exciting watching this team this upcoming season, even though they are pretty geriatric at their center group. They also brought in Ryan Raves. That'd be a fun name. They brought in Ryan Graves into their defensive group. So that potentially could give Erik Karlsson a pairing partner there and more of a stay-at-home role there. So anyway, I'm curious to see what the dynamics are with how these two elite and potentially future Hall of Fame defensemen are managed. All right, Carolina Hurricanes. I don't have too many questions for the regular season with this team. It's more about what they can do in the playoffs, because I do think that they're pretty much the definition of snake bit in the NHL. If anything, can they figure out their power play troubles? They brought in Max Pacioretty last year. He would have been a great fix for it, but the problem was that he pretty much missed all of last season. They weren't horrible last year. They were 19.8%, which would have been pretty good about 5 years ago, but of course, offense is going up. They were under 18% in the playoffs, though, so that does speak to the talent on this roster, or lack thereof, when it comes to the man advantage. I think a healthy Andrei Svechnikov could help with that. Michael Bunting as a presence in front of the net should help as well, so I do like that. But even so, could they add to their top 6 in the offseason, or in the around the trade deadline? They would have to. But of course, they'd have to be willing to part with some assets. And I look at somebody like maybe Brett Pesce. He's been the subject of trade conversations before. They do have the best defensive core in the Eastern Conference. Now we get to the Philadelphia Flyers. I think this one's pretty obvious for some of you out there. What's the future for Carter Hart and Travis Konecny? Carter Hart, last season, a .907 save percentage, a 2.94 goals against average, 4.4 goals saved above average on a bad Philadelphia team. He's a free agent at the end of the season, or a restricted free agent. So is there an opportunity for them to get some value to help them with their rebuild? He does have that upside in that he could be potentially a good fit for a team that needs that goaltending depth, i.e. Seattle. He played not too far from there, I believe, in Everett with the Silvertips. Also, with Travis Konecny, he's a free agent at the end of next season, but he's coming off a season where he only played 60 games, but he had 31 goals. So the idea here is, can they get a lot of return for Konecny while he still has a little bit of contract left and while he's still producing at a very high rate? Could they sell high on Konecny right now? Or is there a possibility he could score over 40 this next season? Konecny could possibly be a good fit for the Hurricanes, by the way. Anyway, for the Washington Capitals, could their forwards stay healthy this upcoming season? So Tom Wilson, he only played in 33 this past season. Ovechkin missed a handful. He played in 73. Anthony Mantha is perennially injured. He played in 67. Nicholas Backstrom was injured to start the year. He ended up with 39 games. TJ Oshie only 58 games, and Max Pacioretty, who was acquired in the offseason, basically missed this last year. Now with the Capitals, it's important that these players stay healthy because they do have some aging veterans on this team. And so if those guys aren't producing quite as well as they have previously in their career, and other players are getting injured as well, that's just not a good recipe for success. They're not a world beater defensively. Very curious to see how Rasmus Sandin does. Also, can they find a way to move on from Yevgeny Kuznetsov? But that whole story has been talked about quite a bit already. All right, and for the New York Islanders, can they fix their power play? They were 15.8% in the regular season, just 0.2 of a point away from dead last. Now, Bo Horvat will hopefully be a key piece of solving that equation. In his 30 games, though, on the man advantage with the Islanders, he had just 1 goal and 3 assists. Not particularly good. At least with the Islanders, they don't lean on any one player particularly to light it up, so it could be by committee. Noah Dobson certainly is progressing and could be a big piece of that going forward as well. Now let's get to the Central. I'm going to start with the Winnipeg Jets. It's very interesting how they kept their GM and also their head coach. So we wonder, with somebody like Dubois being on the move, with Wheeler not signing, right? Could they lose another couple of key pieces to this roster in the likes of Connor Hellebuck and Mark Scheifele? Don't forget, Scheifele this past season, 42 goals. He is a unrestricted free agent at the end of the season. You also have Connor Hellebuck, who is perennially a Vezina Trophy candidate out there. So could the Jets really accelerate, not necessarily a rebuild, but a retool by trading out an elite goaltender like Hellebuck, or still a very productive scorer in Scheifele, even with them on the roster? With this division being a little bit weaker, you can't count the Jets out entirely for being in playoff contention this upcoming season, I don't think. Now let's get to the St. Louis Blues. This team really is a far cry from where they were when they won the Stanley Cup a few years ago. And because they haven't been able to really trade out their defense, it's an aging group for the most part with bad contracts, and Jordan Binnington just hasn't been consistently that number one goaltender that they need. With that happening, with some of those 20 goal scorers from 2 seasons ago departing as well, with the captaincy of Ryan O'Reilly gone and also the leadership of Pietrangelo before him, look, it seems like Craig Berube has kind of been in position to kind of fail, just being set up this way. So could he be on the hot seat if this team isn't contending early on? They brought in Kevin Hayes in the offseason, but even so, they've lost, I think, too much personnel to be a top 3 team in this division. Prove me wrong, St. Louis, though. So anyway, if I look at a coach who's on the hot seat, I wouldn't be surprised if Berube was one of the first ones that we're talking about earlier on in the season. All right, Minnesota Wild. Of course, we could talk about their lack of center depth, but this is a related point. Do they have enough finish in the top 6? So, of course, Kaprizov is going to get his 40 goals in a shortened season for him, and Matt Boldy already has a 30-goal season under his belt. But you look at the players outside of that. You have Ryan Hartman. He has been over 30 before. Eriksson Ek, I like him quite a bit as well, but he's not going to light it up for like 80 necessarily. You also have Matt Zuccarello, who had 22 goals and 45 assists, but he's getting a little bit older as well. So I think that there is kind of a void there in the top 6, especially if you look at somebody like, Marcus Johansson maybe being a part of the second line. So could there be somebody acquired? I don't know if it's going to be a trade or somebody who comes in from the prospect pool and makes that kind of impact so that this team can have a good complement to their great defense and goaltending. It was very good this past season after being a much more offensive-oriented club just 2 years ago. So that's what the loss of Kevin Fiala is going to do to you. Maybe, I would love to see this, but Adam Beckman, former Spokane Chief, right? He could possibly be somebody who gets a look in that sort of role this upcoming season because Liam Ogren and Danila Yurov are going to be under contract to play in Europe, so they can't quite come into the Wild system just yet. Now we get to the Chicago Blackhawks. Of course, I could talk about Connor Bedard here, but don't forget, they also have a potential franchise cornerstone on defense this upcoming season in Kevin Korchinski. They do have a lot of voids when it comes to defensive positions on this team, so I would love to see Korchinski come in and have an impact and help with Bedard and also Lucas Reichel start to kind of form that new core there in Chicago. He was the 7th overall pick in 2022 and had a fantastic year in the WHL with the Seattle Thunderbirds. He played in 54 games, 11 goals, 62 assists with a plus 50 rating. It'd be awesome to see what kind of chemistry he could develop with Connor Bedard on the power play. And of course, Lucas Reichel is somebody who did get a look this past season. He played 23 games, But yeah, they could definitely have him for a full season. It's just, is he going to stay at wing, or could he potentially play center for this team? All right, now on to the Arizona Coyotes. I'm kind of excited to watch them this upcoming season. Can this team find its way into the playoff contention conversation in the second half of this year? Can they be competitive like that and potentially over an 82-game season? I'm not saying playoffs, right? But the thing is that this team might be slept on a little bit going into this year. We know about the great season that Clayton Keller had, 37 goals, 49 assists. Barrett Hayton had kind of a breakout season. Schmaltz actually was still producing fairly well for them. Matthias Michelli was in that Calder Trophy race. And then you get a full season of a top 10 pick like Dylan Guenther, and Logan Cooley as well could be cracking the lineup and making an impact on this young Coyotes team. They also acquired Matt Dumba in a affordable signing there, and Sean Durzi came over in a trade with some puck-moving capabilities. So with that makeup already, and with the Central Division getting a little bit weaker, who knows, the Coyotes could be a team that kind of plays that sleeper role, or kind of plays that spoiler role, I want to say, where they start beating some of the teams that you would expect to secure a top 3 spot in this division. So anyway, don't sleep on Arizona, but I'm not necessarily saying that they're making the playoffs. All right. Colorado Avalanche. Now, the story going into last year was how will they play without Landeskog? That's the same thing this year, but the question I want to focus on here is Jonathan Drouin due for a renaissance season? So in this past year, he played in 59 games, 2 goals, and 27 assists. He hasn't played a full season in quite a while, but the thing here is that, oh boy, he has the prospect of pairing with Nathan McKinnon. They played together in Halifax back in the day, and they also played on Canada's national team. Mikko Rantanen, of course, being a part of that picture as well. I like the second line too. So if you have Lehkonen and Nichushkin pairing with Ryan Johansson, good acquisition there in the offseason, then yeah, you could have a top 6 spot open there for Jonathan Drouin. So assuming that he's healthy, I don't know, could this guy be due for 60, 65 points, maybe even more? All right, Dallas Stars. Can they rebound on the penalty kill? I don't have too many questions about Dallas right now. The defense kind of fell apart in the playoffs. Ottinger was not on the top of his game whatsoever, but he's young. He's going to bounce back. He'll be just fine. They were 24th in penalty kill in this previous season, 11th most penalties committed in the NHL as well. So hopefully they could have a couple of younger defensemen assisting with this upcoming season. So you look at Thomas Harley and you look at Nils Lundqvist. Other than that, though, I like the way the Stars are comprised, especially looking at the Matt Duchene deal. That looked pretty good. They have, a couple of young superstars on this team as well. All right, Nashville. Assuming that they have a healthy Philip Forsberg, he missed half the season last year, and also Ryan O'Reilly, right? Can they sneak into the playoffs? This is a team that necessarily isn't expected to do all that much damage, but you take a look at how this team performed when their whole top line was injured. They almost made it into the postseason. They came down to the wire there to secure a last spot there in the West. Now, Ryan O'Reilly, could he have the same kind of impact that he did with the Maple Leafs? That would definitely help their case. Philip Forsberg, a former 40-goal scorer, and the rise of a couple of young forwards on this team, like, of course, Thomas Novak, Luke Evangelista, Cody Glass, right? So they could have a couple of kind of emerging young forwards being supported by, these veterans with a good track record. Other than that, kind of like with the Jets, if they are sort of faltering early, do they entertain a trade for Jussi Saros being on the move? And lastly, we conclude with the Atlantic Division, and this is going to be the meat grinder of the NHL. Man, I'm so fired up to watch this because you have 7 teams potentially contending for a playoff spot this year. So we'll start with the team that won the Eastern Conference this year, or this past year, Florida Panthers. Can they start stronger than they did this past season? Stylistically, they've been a very different team since Paul Maurice took over, and they finally caught on to what Paul Maurice hockey is all about down the stretch there when they made it into the playoffs, when their defense was tighter. Certainly Alex Lyon had a big role in that. So anyway, if Bobrovsky isn't on his game, will Spencer Knight be ready to, at least shoulder some of the load there? Can Matthew Tkachuk still be at that Hart Trophy caliber level of performance? And altogether, yeah, are these Panthers going to come out like the Panthers we saw from later in the season? All right, Buffalo Sabres. Is this the year they snap the drought? So it's been now 12 years since the Sabres were last in the playoffs. This team has lots of firepower. Top 5 offense, certainly it could be. And a lot of players are very young, not even approaching their prime just yet or getting into their prime. Somebody like Tage Thompson. And the defense, you have a top pairing in the making with Rasmus Dahlin, was part of that Norris Trophy conversation. I know I said Vezina last year in a video. And of course, you have Owen Power, who was in the Calder Trophy race as well. I am a little bit concerned about the goaltending with the likes of Eric Comrie. He had a bad year after a very strong year the season before. And you have some young goaltenders like Devin Levi. We'll see how many starts he gets. And you also have Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, best name in the NHL. But I do like some of the defensive augmentations they made in the offseason with Connor Clifton coming over and also the experienced Eric Johnson. Detroit Red Wings. Man, this will be an interesting team because here's Yzerman at the draft this year saying, we're still, building this team. We're still, in the rebuild. And then he goes out and signs a bazillion veterans, right? So how will the pieces fit together? That's, I guess, my chief question here. How much of a role will they have in the near future? Are these just mercenaries while they wait for some of the young talent to come in or some more of the young talent to come in? You still want to provide opportunity for players like Michael Rasmussen, Jonathan Berggren, Simon Edvinsson, especially to develop. You want to give them opportunity. So what's going to be that sort of dynamic between some of those veterans who came in and some of the younger players? Do we see a bounce back from Lucas Raymond and an offensive breakout for Moritz Seider? Curious to see that as well. But yeah, you're going to be managing a roster that has those youngsters in addition to, of course, Alex DeBrincat. I mean, man, it's going to be exciting watching him with Dylan Larkin, most likely. You also have Daniel Sprung, over 20 goals this past season. Shane Gostisbehere, who has been surprisingly very good the past couple of years. Jeff Petrie came in recently in a trade with the Canadiens. Justin Hull, Christian Fischer, and also Clint Costin. Liked what he did down the stretch and in the postseason with Edmonton. So, yeah, I mean, this is going to be one of those teams battling for a playoff spot. I think they have what it takes on paper, but I think that you have to see how these new players all sort of gel together. All right, Boston Bruins. I mean, they lost Bergeron and Krejci to retirement. They lost some other players that they had acquired this past season at the trade deadline. I guess, can David Pastrnak, is he going to be the MVP of the NHL? Because even though their defense is top tier in the NHL and their goaltending has been very good for them, with this division, to get a top 3 spot, I think that Pastrnak needs to at least replicate what he did this past season. Marchand, a great leader. He's getting a little bit older, though, so a lot falls on David Pastrnak's shoulders. 61 goals and 52 assists this last year. Can he replicate that, even with a couple of his teammates gone now? All right, Montreal Canadiens. Will Uri Slafkovsky earn a full-time spot in the top 6? So this past season, he only averaged over 12 minutes of time on ice per game, and he did struggle a little bit, 4 goals and 6 assists before getting injured. So you want that big physical presence there. Kirby Dach would be a great pairing on that sort of line if you want to form like a Montreal Legion of Doom. They have lots of firepower in the waiting in the wings, I should say, and they have some strong young defensemen on this team. So the future does look bright for them. But really, if you want the Canadiens to show that they're taking a step forward this season, I think Uri Slafkovsky has to be a piece of that. He doesn't have to be catalyzing everything, but he has to be contributing along the likes of a Kirby Dach. Excuse me. I'm excited to see what they can do with him with a full season, both of them. Tampa Bay Lightning, do they have enough in the middle 6? The top line, tremendous, right? Stamkos, Kucherov, Point. But you look beyond that, right? Brandon Hagel, congratulations on the new extension, by the way. 8 years at $6.5 million per. He exploded for 30 plus goals. But beyond that, who else is going to put the puck in the net for this team? You have Anthony Cirelli, love his defense, but he's not a goal scorer so much. You have Nick Paul, Mikey Eyssimont. Tanner Jeannot was a huge disappointment this past season, and he almost has to redeem himself in that sort of a role, given how much Julien Brisebois had paid for his services, right? So I think that that's kind of the most important thing looking at the Lightning going forward, especially as we get into the playoffs. If the top line gets shut down, who beyond that is going to be at least giving them some quality scoring chances out there? All right, 2 more teams here. Ottawa Senators, kind of like the Buffalo Sabres, can their goaltending hold its own enough to get into the playoffs? So in order for that to happen, you're going to need Jonas Korpisalo, who he's like the most wildly inconsistent goaltender season to season. You know, he's making a record amount of saves in the playoffs one year, then he's like the worst starting goaltender in the NHL a couple years after that. This last year, though, he played great, both in Columbus and also in Los Angeles, a 914 save percentage, a 2.87 goals against average, 11.5 goals saved above expected, So that's fantastic. So if he replicates that, some people think that the Blue Jackets, some people think that the Senators could be in the playoff conversation. I think they could, really. They have somebody like Jake Sanderson due for a breakout season, I think. And even though they lost to Brinkett, here they bring in Tarasenko, they bring in Kubalik, and also Josh Norris, who missed pretty much all of last year. He comes back. So I think the Senators are due for a season of being competitive over 82 games. And if Korpisalo is what he was last year, who knows? This team could be in the postseason. And lastly, for the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? It's Austin Matthews and William Nylander. Are they going to stay on the team? What are their contracts going to look like? The salary cap situation is going to be tight for the Leafs. I know it's going up in the next couple of seasons, but even so, do these guys want to be a part of the Maple Leafs going forward? Because if they're not that interested, I mean, things could get particularly tough for them over the next couple of years. So yeah, it's all about that, quite frankly, and we're probably going to hear about that quite a lot over the course of the season. Anyway, hey, if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. Drop a seal or a sea lion emoji in the comments. Let me know, because I did go to my hometown of Monterey over the past week. It was great just kicking back and enjoying some time off. I'm excited to deliver you some content as we head into this upcoming year. I do have lots of ideas planned, but feel free to shout out some other ideas that you have in the comments down below and let me know your thoughts, right? What is the most concerning matter for your favorite team this upcoming year? Anyway, Twisters, thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Nick, and I'll catch you later. Ciao for now.